Conscience in Action Part 3. In 2007, the AACE published a book entitled Conscience in Action, which was received enthusiastically around Australia. We've made some introductions regarding this book in the previous podcasts. This is Part 3, where we continue listening to some of the experiences of those who went through conscientious objection during the period of World War II. Brother Ian Wallace from Melbourne shares his experiences from World War II.
When call-up came, we had to register, and it wasn't long before I got information that I had to go for a medical examination. And when they found that you were fit, they immediately sent you into an office before a captain of the army and asked to take the allegiance to the Queen. I refused to do that. They told me, "Well, you realise what'll happen. You'll be charged." And I said, "Well, so be it." And it wasn't long before I got the notification to attend the court. They put me through the third degree. It's the reason why I wouldn't join the forces. And eventually, after must have been about an hour's interrogation, they told me that I'd end up in jail, which I did. I was taken out to Coburg and into Pentridge. I was there over the weekend. I was sitting down in one of the remand yards, sort of like a spokes to the wheel, with the warder sitting up on top watching everything that was going on. And he Emily got interested in what I was in there for, so I told him. And I went before a magistrate of the jail. They interrogated me for what I believed and so forth, and then they put me into the section of the jail which was a library, and that's where all the different people who were in jail were working. When it was time, my month was up. On the Sunday, I was sitting in this remand yard, and it was a pretty hot day, and the call came to who wanted to go to church. Well, they didn't say anything about Christadelphians, of course, but I thought, well, I may as well go and hear what he's got to say rather than sit in the remand yard. So I did, and when he had given his sermon or whatever it was, he walked down the aisle and spoke to one of the warders in the room where we all were. It must have been about 100 chaps in the room. And he said, "I want to have a talk to Mr. Wallace if I can." And he said, "I'd like you to know that I don't agree with your position." And we got out on Christmas Eve. In the meantime, we'd had this message from a brother and sister Harrop. It was on a wheat farm up in a little place called Larne, up near Warwick-Nabil. So I decided that I'd go up there, and he had already taken in two of the young brethren, hoping that working for him, who had a wheat farm, we'd be exempt. But we weren't. I was doing that and looked up, and there was the military car coming down the road and looking for me. So he came over to me and asked me then would I join the forces, and I said, "No, my position is still the same." He said, "Well, you realise you had a month's jail before, you'll probably get 3 months next time." And I said, "Well, so be it." So the time came when I had to go to the court in Horsham. He asked the captain of that was there to try to get me to join the forces, and he said, has he had any previous conviction? And the captain said, "Not under my jurisdiction." And he said, "Well, if that's the case," he said, "I'll fine him £5. So that's what happened. I was fined £5, and I was allowed to get back onto the wheat farm, and that was the end of it.
From page 88, there was considerable activity throughout 1939 to 1941 with intense lobbying from the CSC and various Ecclesias to encourage the government to allow for total conscientious objection. A turning point came in July 1941 when the War Cabinet made a decision to follow the practice adopted by Great Britain, The Cabinet minute was expressed in the following terms. Consideration was given to the recommendation by the Minister for the Army that the Defence Act should be amended to provide for A. the exemption from combatant service of such persons mentioned whose beliefs do not allow them to perform such service, but whose beliefs do allow them to carry out duties of a non-combatant nature, and B. the complete exemption from all service of persons mentioned whose beliefs do not allow them to perform any service in the defence of the nation, either as combatants or as non-combatants. Brother Phil Wilson.
There was Brother Charles Briggs, the late Brother Charles Briggs, the late Brother Bruce Seaman, and myself, and we're all baptised about the same time. But then it came to the point that we happened to be the three chosen. Brother Gordon Wolfe, and he was power of strength to us all. He had the stance and everything else to present himself as a representative, not for us, but as a supporter. One question stuck out. He said to Brother Charles Briggs, who was in Holden's then, the prosecutor said to him, he said, I see you're supplying goods to the army, and the lawyer then played his part and said, yes, Your Honour, but these boats were also used for retreating. I find it very difficult to reflect my mind back to those days in 1939 and the worry, the strain and stress that we young brethren went through, realising that there was no provision for us in the beginning at all. I was working at Dunlop's in Adelaide, and one of the men I was working with came up to me and he said, they tell me you're a conscientious objector. I said, yes, Jim, I am. And he was a boxer actually, and he often hauled off and knocked me out cold and said, it's the last word you say to me. And I'm afraid I was nearly thought afterwards it took me a while, a real big shiner, black eye and everything for days. Everybody asking me what happened, because the other traps that were working with us wouldn't stay cleared out. They had the department and they didn't want to be part of it. And it got to the managing director. He called me into his office and he wanted to know. I said, I don't want to say anything about it, sir. I've got my job to do and I want to do it. He was a retired army captain from World War I. And the words he spoke were terrific. He had great honour for a man and respect for a person that lived to their word. And I think that's one thing I learned, that to stand up before men and to confess your loyalty to the Lord Jesus Christ is one of the most strengthening things an individual can get. We had the cases of one by the name of Walter Berthold Hoffmann, a brother that came into the truth at the beginning of the war. But he came from the German descendancy area in the Barossa Valley, and he was very, very loyal to his position in the Rifle Club. And he had an answer for him why he was in the Rifle Club. Oh, but he said, I'm not now. Oh, but he said, you were. And because he has a German extraction, he had a very, very tough time, and I witnessed this with him, because at that time, my mother and we were teaching him the truth. He had heard of the truth through my mother having a little shop, and he used to deliver drinks to her. And Mum always had the Bible under the desk and brought it forth to anybody like that. And in result of all that, he won through and he became one of our very, very strong brethren. The court case lasted over a period of 12 months. Well, firstly, as all were called up to their local drill hall or the army depot and put through all the hard trials and third degrees you could imagine. And it would last up to 3 hours, 4 hours. And it wouldn't only be one person, it'd be the captain, the sergeant and everybody else having a flog at you as hard as they could go and trying to convince you to change your mind. No way. The brother that has put on the name of Christ with sincerity couldn't. So it's the way we kept our sanity to a degree, because wherever you went, the finger was pointed to you. White feathers were very prevalent, and incidents of, what do we call it, violence, I suppose, against you, all sorts of torments for different ones. And as far as I was concerned, in my court case, I was one of the 3 first appointed ones to stand trial. We were all day in court, and we stood all the questioning and propositions, things we just couldn't adhere to at all. And there was nothing left for us but the possibility of the army dealing with us as they wanted to. But as it was a civil court, and for which we thank God, we had a more humane sort of a judgment. And they had word that Chifley was on his way to England to interview Churchill as to what might be done with conscientious objectors. The judge adjourned the court until a later date, until we could get Mr. Chifley's reply as to what the judgments would be. And the judge asked me directly, if Christ wanted you to shoot me, would you do it? I said, yes, sir. If Christ asked me to do it, I would do it. And he said, leave me to wallow in the blood in my own gutter. 12 months later, I reappeared in court to get a judgment. He remembered that, and he said, you're the man that was going to shoot me. And Brother Gordon Walkup, who was supporting us, he got up and spoke very wisely, and he said, Your Honour, may I speak? And he said, go ahead. He said, you've asked a question of Mr. Wilson, and he probably would never ever receive a question like that from Christ, because if Christ wanted you out of the way, it'd just flash an eyelid. And the whole court went silent, and so did the judge. And he said, thank you, Mr. Walkup.
Meanwhile, on May 30 of 1941, 3 Christadelphians were prosecuted in a Melbourne court. They were convicted and released on a bond of £50 as a surety for the same amount to be of good behaviour for the war. This is one demonstration of the inconsistency of the judiciary. Even though all 3 were charged under the Defence Act for not taking the oath, they were given a suspended sentence. Sister Dulcie Anderson shares her memories of the experience that her husband, Brother Lloyd, had.
After the Jehovah's Witnesses were finished, it was Lloyd next, so he got the brunt of it. But they did their best to get him in. They turned round and said, well, you'll just have to go into the ambulance. And Father said, no, he can't. And he said, why can't he? And he said, because he'd have to carry a gun. And he said, no, they don't. And Father said, they do. And he quoted the charter number for the ambulance. And he said, I didn't know that before. So then they turned round and finished questioning the others. They were all foregone conclusion they were going to get sentenced because of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So he was told he had 6 months, Lloyd. He was the first to be sentenced, actually. They immediately, there was a Mr. Anderson stood up for Lloyd, And as soon as the sentence was passed, he said, "I'm not related." So we went down to this cafe, and she said, "You should be thankful he got sentenced," she said, "for Christ." I mean, it was all right for her. I'd only been married a month. I didn't feel too good, but I knew that it was nothing to do with me. It was, if that was the Lord's work, that he had to be tested, he had to be tested. They said they would appeal. We were waiting and waiting and waiting, because Lloyd was to be the test case, and if that was right, it's right for Australia.
As a result of the legislation introduced to enable men to be granted exemption conditional upon their engaging in work that was under civilian control and of a civilian nature, the government established two organisations. The first, in January 1942, was the Manpower Directorate, under the Minister for Labour and National Service. This directorate was deemed necessary because of the massive manpower shortage caused by recruitment into the armed forces with the advent of the declaration of war on Japan. The above situation presented another problem for Christadelphians. While those granted exemption from military service were able to be placed in work of a civilian character and control, there were many work positions, such as the manufacture of munitions, that while under civilian control were not acceptable to Christadelphians because they were directly related to the war effort and killing, and therefore were against their conscience. Sister Lorna Wigsall.
There wasn't a lot of, pressure to join the army at first. It wasn't until a little bit later, when things were getting a bit hotter and a bit closer to Australia, that the men were called up for registration. Well, they were brought before the courts at that time. There was quite a lot of pressure put on them. I know my husband, when he came home, he was pretty, worked up and het up about things. And at that stage, there was quite a few write-ups in the newspapers about these men who were conscientious, so-called conscientious objectors, and they didn't want to go and fight for their country, and a write-up on that description. Their names were all blazoned in the papers, so they knew, like people knew, neighbours knew, and the employers knew that they were conscientious objectors. Cleon was left actually there. He was branded a CO, and got a pretty hard time because the others said, well, they'd gone off to fight for their country, but he was a bit of a slacker and didn't want to go. However, eventually he got put off from John Martin's, and then the real trouble started, because at that stage the manpower was set up. Of course, they had to go before the manpower to apply for jobs and all that sort of thing. And because their names had all been put in the papers, they knew who were COs and who were, just ones that didn't want to go because of other reasons. And when they went to, the manpower gave them places of employment that they had to go and apply for these jobs. And the manpower must have notified the employers that the ones seeking for a job were COs, and because of that they wouldn't employ them. They said straight out on quite a few occasions they didn't want, those that were slackers, they called them, that they wouldn't go and fight for their country. They didn't want them working, for their firm. I don't know how many jobs he interviewed, but eventually he got in touch with the manager from Udunda Farmers, who was a Church of Christ man. And of course he understood the position of a CO. And he said he had this position at Whyalla. He went to the Manpower and said that he had this job offered to him at Whyalla, but it meant giving up his home and, transferring. At this stage we had 2 children, and Clem was only 10 months old at the time, and meant that, we'd have to leave our families and go up to Whyalla and leave our home and everything, which of course was the right thing for him to say, because the Manpower said, and what do you think the soldiers have done? They've given up everything, and more than perhaps you have, because they may be giving up their lives. So we were sent up to Whyalla.
By 1942, I read from page 122, it was a time of considerable stress in Australia. When so many were actively involved in defending the country, it's understandable that there was trenchant criticism in some quarters of the community. Smith's Weekly was a major national newspaper during the first half of the 20th century and peaked at a circulation of some 300,000 in the 1940s. In June 1942, under the headline Christadelphians and the War, Is the Sect a Retreat for Slackers?, the paper engaged in a trenchant criticism of the stand taken. And I quote, "Now the time has come when a warning must be issued to the sect known as Christadelphians, for there is growing evidence that slackers are using it as a means of escaping military duty." Brother Wally Crew gives his personal experiences. Wally was put in the Palin Creek prison in 1942.
During the war years, people were taken from their homes and imprisoned because they refused to obey the authorities and join the armed forces. They were conscientious objectors to all forms of military service. I was caught up in this recruitment drive, and in 1942, being about 29 years of age and married with 3 young children, I was summoned to appear in a magistrate's court on a charge of refusing to take an oath of enlistment into the army. I was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment with hard labour in His Majesty's prison. At the time there was no provision to appeal against the sentence. That right came later, and although I took advantage of the provision, it took the authorities 5 months to bring it on in the Supreme Court early in 1943. When it did come, I was able to defend myself, the judge asking me to take the stand and take as long as I wished to give my reasons why my conscience would not allow me to join the army. And I well remember addressing the court for about 1.5 hours, being questioned by the judge and later by the barrister appearing for the army. The barrister appearing on my behalf told me he would look after the legal side only, because he did not understand my objection, and therefore I must defend myself. I was glad to do this. The result of it, I was exempted from all forms of military service, and after thanking the judge I left the court. But the 6-month sentence still applied, as it was taken in another court, and I was therefore transferred back to Boggo Road Jail to complete my 6-month sentence with another month to go. My family was greatly affected. I was immediately sacked from my work and told by the manager of the tramways department that I could never get a job there anymore, for he had lost a son in the war. And we were at a loss to know how to get on. I found later that the Ecclesias and my parents came to the rescue, and they made sure that my wife and children had enough to eat. And as we were living in rented premises, they also were kind enough to pay the rent. There was a certain brother who owned a grocer's shop, and he gave us all the groceries that we needed. Even when I came out of prison, it was very difficult to obtain work, and until I did so, this same brother helped us with groceries. And I was later able to repay him when I got back into work. It was a very worrying time for my wife and my family. Both my wife's parents and her brothers and sisters rejected her, and we were subjected to ridicule and contempt by all our acquaintances. Walking along the road, people would cross the street rather than walk past us on the footpath or say anything to us. There was another occasion when I went to the tramway depot where the men had their dinner, because I wished to speak to a man whom I used to work with. And every man in that dining room got up and walked out. It was also a common thing to receive in post letters of an abusive content, or some with a white feather in them, which was the symbol of cowardice, for we were called cowards among many other things. We saw the general public, like the psalmist, very critical, not understanding our views, and like the wicked they spread themselves like a green bay tree. Yet we have seen them pass away, and lo, they are not, exactly as the psalmist said in Psalm 37. But as regards our brothers and sisters, the brothers and sisters of our Lord, these were our friends, and we were content. One would ask, what was it like in prison? The inside of the building was composed of cells on all walls. They were about 10 feet by 7 feet each, all made of solid concrete. There were 3 stories of these, with a stairway reaching to the top floor. Each cell was about 10 foot high, with a window at the top, a very small window just for ventilation. The door was of steel with a grill in the centre, through which food was passed to the prisoner. After receiving the food in a tin plate, the prisoner had to stand at the rear of the cell whilst a knife and fork were thrown into the cell onto the floor. This was for security reasons, as a prisoner had recently had a knife handed to him through the grill, and immediately he thrust the same knife through a warder's mouth. This was the type of people that we were with. There was a swinging bed between the 2 walls, like a hammock, no pillows, and 1 blanket because it was summertime. As no one is allowed out at night, a 5-gallon oil drum served as a toilet. For clothing, a shirt and trousers were issued once a week on shower day, when each prisoner was escorted to the shower block and given clean clothes. A pair of boots was also given to each man. As long as one's feet went into the boots, it seemed to be all that mattered, because mine were 2 sizes too big, and they seem to have been worn by hundreds of others before me. Breakfast was a place of what they call hominy. It was like boiled, crushed corn, no milk, no sugar. Usually refused at first by many, until hunger made eating compulsory. Really tasteless porridge, and it took some time to get accustomed to it. But when one did, it seemed to be all right. It was supposed to be good health-wise, because it was supposed to obtain a lot of oil. The midday meal consisted of a piece of bread and jam, and the evening meal at about 5 o'clock was really the only decent meal. It was some kind of stew usually, with vegetables and a piece of bread. Never any sweets. The food seemed to be rationed out according to the time one was in jail. The long-term prisoners had more food plus tea and sugar, which, of course, we were denied. I know that when I came out of jail I was so thin and weak I had great difficulty in standing up in a moving tram. The majority of our companions, of course, were thieves, drunkards and murderers. There was no distinction being made at all. All were treated in the same way by the warders. Outside each cell door was a card. It named the person's name, the offence and the length of sentence, so that each prisoner, as he walked past the other cell, could see all the details of his fellow prisoners. Every morning we had to march single file into a prison exercise yard and do some sort of exercise. On entering the yard we had to salute a warder. Many refused to do this. When they did, they were put into solitary confinement for 2 or 3 days, and without food, they were forced to salute. This happened with quite a lot of the sect known as Jehovah's Witnesses, because they looked upon the prison authorities as mercenaries of the devil. The warder explained that he was the representative of His Majesty, and as I knew the commandment to honour the king, I therefore had no difficulty in obeying the law and salute the man as I walked past. This did not trouble me. The prison had several acres of garden. We were allowed to work in the garden for about 5 hours a day. This was to constitute the meaning of hard labour. It wasn't really hard, but it was really something to do, and it was good to get out into the fresh air. The prison itself was self-supporting as regarding its own vegetables. Inside the cells, for long hours, it was very boring. I asked for something to read, and I was told that no reading matter of any kind was allowed in the cells at all. And of course there was no wirelesses in the cells in those days. I believe there is now, but it wasn't then. However, a warder came back later, and he said to me, "There is one book you are allowed to have. It is on the top of a cupboard in the office. It is covered with dust. It's been there for years, and nobody has ever asked for it. So I don't suppose you will want that." And laughingly he went away. Later I asked him what book it was, and he said, "It's a Bible." I told him that was the very book I would like to have, as my Bible had been taken away from me with my civilian clothes. And so I was able to have a Bible, and what a joy it was. I was able to read every day, and as my appeal was coming up, it was of great assistance to me, because I was also allowed a Bible in the Supreme Court. The prison rules allowed a prisoner to have a visit from relatives once a week, but if a letter was received, no visit was permitted. So I saw my wife once a week. She had to stand behind a wire screen, and I was behind another wire screen with a 3-foot space between the two screens. And in that space was a warder who walked up and down, listening to all that was being said. The interview, however, would only last about 10 minutes. I heard that another brother had been imprisoned and was somewhere in the big building. So when all was quiet at night, I sang a verse from one of our well-known hymns. "Happy are they and only they who from thy precepts never stray." Only 2 lines in case someone objected, which they certainly would if they heard the noise. And I was thrilled when I heard an answer come back from somewhere in the building. Who know what's right, not only so, but always practice what they know. We never saw each other, as we were in different parts of the prison, but we knew we were both there. Later on we did meet each other, and were very good friends. That brother now sleeps in the grave, and we will meet again some day in circumstances which we hope to share again, not in a prison, but in the glory with our Lord Jesus Christ.